"I object," the black woman said, her voice steady as it echoed through the grand cathedral. Every head turned, whispers rippling through the sea of finely dressed guests. You might think you know why she stood there, interrupting the perfect wedding of a wealthy real estate mogul and his glamorous bride-to-be. But trust me, the truth is far more explosive than you expect. Where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments and let us know your guess before the full story unfolds. Because when we tell you what led to this moment, from the quiet cracks in a 2-year marriage to the shocking evidence revealed at the altar, you'll realize that not all love stories end in happily ever after. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next twist, and share this with someone who believes they've heard every kind of wedding drama until today. Liora Okafor had always believed that a house became a home when breath and memory settled into the corners. In the glass-walled apartment high above the river, she felt both, because every surface held a trace of the life she and Thomas Whitmore were building. The kitchen island carried chalk marks from nights she sketched facades on butcher paper, while he uncorked bottles and talked about parcels and permitting boards, and the hallway whispered with the soft scuff of their shoes returning late, shoulders touching as city lights spooled beneath them like a runway. He loved to say the view made him forgive the city's noise, while she teased that good insulation did the same job at a fraction of the cost, and they would meet in the middle of that banter with a kiss seasoned by laughter. She had arrived in his world with rolled-up plans and a spine that did not bow, and he had arrived in hers with funding, charm, and a hunger to leave his name in steel and stone, so together they seemed inevitable, like skyline and river, each defining the other. Their friends, slick with enthusiasm, called them a power couple, but Liora liked a humbler phrase, telling anyone who asked that they were partners with different tools in the same blueprint. On mornings that felt like beginnings, she pressed her palm to the window and imagined the buildings she would draw in neighborhoods starved of thoughtful design, and he, passing behind her with a watch already set for meetings, would murmur that the city would be lucky to have her. They ate breakfast that cooled as they swapped calendars, and they taped paint chips to sunlight for decisions they conscientiously refused to rush. And at night they walked through their home naming it, not with words but with intent, deciding which room would hold music and which would cradle quiet. He had a way of talking about scale that made her feel larger, not because he magnified her, but because he believed there was room enough for both of them to expand. So when he proposed in the unfinished lobby of a future tower, she laughed and cried at once, imagining the lobby finished and their promise cured within its polished stone. The ceremony, elegantly small, felt less like a spectacle and more like a cornerstone. And when the minister spoke of foundations, Liora nearly smiled at the comforting literalness of it all. Returning to the apartment as newlyweds, they toasted with the cheap champagne they liked, and he lifted her, not because tradition required it, but because he wanted to see her eyes at the height of the doorway, where architects mark thresholds and businessmen mark beginnings. She set about designing a life with the meticulous joy she gave to site plans. Morning run routes mapped to shade, dinner playlists calibrated to the cadence of their fork and glass conversations, weekend walks that looped past buildings she adored so she could talk about cornices without apology. He set about multiplying deals, arriving home with a loosened tie, and stories that seemed to multiply too. And while some wives might have flinched at the velocity of that ambition, Liora admired it, because velocity was also a kind of music if you learned the rhythm. They learned it together because when she missed a beat, he softened the count. And when he raced ahead, she called him back with a look that meant not yet. And in that call and response, they discovered a grammar for their marriage. The apartment slowly absorbed their days. A walnut shelf he built on a dare, a dining table she salvaged and reskinned, a window seat he swore he would use for reading even as his phone lit like an impatient constellation. They entertained people who introduced themselves with perfect handshakes and left thin perfumes of power behind, and after the door clicked shut, Liora and Thomas would dissect the evening like professionals, swapping notes, he about leverage and she about light. Work braided them, not like a rope that binds, but like a river that forks and rejoins. So his acquisitions fed her commissions, and her concepts refined his pitches. and together they moved through rooms with the assurance of a two-person team that trusts the other to catch the falling end of a sentence. When Thomas talked about a waterfront tract, Liora saw a promenade thick with shade trees and benches that would not scorch in summer, and when Liora described a community center with a roof garden, Thomas saw the donors already smiling in the renderings. In this commerce of imagination, each became richer because generosity scaled their dreams. They built rituals around the pressure, a late-night grilled cheese treaty after 2 long days, a shared rule that work could live in any room but the bed, a quarterly promise to attend a small gallery opening where nobody cared about net operating income, and everybody cared about the way color hums against negative space. Their closeness felt engineered yet organic, as if someone had modeled them in 3D and then had the good sense to let the light change, and Liora loved that feeling because it mirrored the best buildings, strong, but with air moving freely through the plan. Sometimes she wondered if happiness, like concrete, demanded curing time and quiet, and on those evenings she would turn down the music and just listen to the apartment, which clicked and settled like a living thing. And he would drift in and press his cheek to her shoulder, his voice low as he told her the city was theirs if they could stomach its appetite. She could, and so could he, they agreed, and they sealed the agreement with the simplest act they knew, setting their alarms a little earlier so morning would widen. When she lay awake, it was not from worry, but from a kind of ignition, because ideas arrived precisely when the world thinned to hush, and she caught them like fireflies and tucked them into the margins of a notebook that smelled of graphite and hope. Their friends said the apartment looked staged, but the accusation felt like praise, because stagecraft is simply intention made visible, and Liora and Thomas were nothing if not intentional. She hung photographs at eye level rather than ego level. He lined the bar with spirits he barely touched because clients liked the label's gravity. And together they chose plants that forgave travel schedules and still made the rooms exhale green. Family visited and left satisfied that the union was both tender and sensible. Colleagues visited and left convinced that synergy was not a boardroom myth. And neighbors, those silent historians of every building, nodded hello in elevators and later whispered that the couple upstairs seemed young and already certain. In quiet hours when the river scribbled moonlight across their ceiling, Thomas would talk about the next project with the hunger of a man who had learned early that doors only open if you arrive as though you own the key, and Liora would answer with sketches, each line a question that invited him to imagine not just profit but place. She could read a site's bones the way he could read a balance sheet, and the respect they traded tasted like a rare sweetness in a city that often salted its successes. If there were shadows, they were the ordinary kind cast by lampshades and long days, and she refused to mistake the function of light for a warning. He teased that she planned even her spontaneity. She teased that he negotiated even his laughter, and they chose to call these quirks complementary rather than combustible. In that choice, they believed, lived the durability of a future, because a home is not a fortress, but a promise, and promises, like beams, are strongest when they are not pretending to be something else. For now the promise held, the rooms inhaled, the city glittered, and the two of them, framed against their window like a rendering that had found its life, stood together and said, without saying it aloud, that everything was exactly as it should be. It began like the faintest crack in a polished surface, the kind you only notice when light catches it just right, and Liora almost convinced herself she imagined it. Thomas started coming home later, always with reasons that sounded reasonable. Client dinners that ran long, unexpected site visits, last-minute negotiations that couldn't be postponed. Yet his explanations carried the sleekness of something rehearsed. She had always trusted his ambition, but now she sensed it walking slightly ahead of him, like a shadow pulling him away. At first, she tried to meet him halfway, staying up with a glass of wine and the hope of hearing his key in the lock, telling herself that couples who worked hard sometimes drifted for a moment before finding each other again. But the drift lengthened, and even when he was home, his mind seemed elsewhere, his phone glowing in his palm with messages he didn't share. When she asked, he would smile in that quick, practiced way that avoided the question without denying it, and she told herself not to pry, because love, like architecture, required space for air to move. Yet the air between them began to feel cold, as if the windows had been left open on a night when the city's wind had nothing gentle to offer. She responded in the only way she knew how, by designing moments the way she designed rooms, each with an intention and a purpose. She booked a reservation at the small Italian place they'd once loved, even ordering the same wine they'd shared after sealing their first joint project, hoping nostalgia might act like mortar between their loosening bricks. She surprised him with tickets to a play he had mentioned months earlier, and she imagined them laughing together in the dark, leaning into each other as they once had. She even proposed a weekend trip to the mountains, their private escape before life had begun to run at double speed, picturing mornings wrapped in blankets and coffee steam. But each gesture seemed to meet a wall. He would nod and thank her, then decline because of some urgent meeting or unavoidable conflict, and the refusal always came with an undertone that suggested she didn't understand the scale of his responsibilities. She found herself wondering if this was how buildings began to collapse, not with a storm, but with the slow decay of connections meant to hold weight. The more she reached, the more he seemed to slip through her fingers, and she began to suspect that his absence wasn't just about work, though she had no proof to press the thought into certainty. The proof arrived in the form of another woman's name, spoken casually but with a frequency that unsettled her. Penelope Hart, Thomas explained one evening, was the face of his company's new luxury development campaign, a model whose look, he said, perfectly captured the elegance he wanted to project. Liora met her for the first time at a company gala, introduced with the smooth courtesy Thomas reserved for business contacts he wanted to impress. Penelope was impossibly polished, all sharp cheekbones and soft blonde waves, dressed in something that managed to look both effortless and expensive. She laughed at Thomas's comments in a way that tilted her head just enough to seem intimate, and Lior noticed the way his eyes held on her for a beat longer than necessary, as if measuring the shape of her smile. It was a look she had seen before, in the early days of their marriage, directed entirely at her. Penelope, for her part, seemed aware of her effect, glancing at Thomas when she thought no one was watching, her lips curling in a secret, almost smile. Liora told herself she was reading too much into small gestures, yet the instincts that guided her design work, spotting hairline flaws before they widened, now told her this was not an isolated crack. After that night, Penelope's name began to appear more often in conversation, usually as a footnote to Thomas's explanations for late hours. He spoke of photo shoots that ran over time, strategy meetings for the campaign, and location visits that somehow required his presence alongside hers. When Liora asked casual questions, the answers came clipped, like an editor cutting a scene before it revealed too much. She noticed changes in his demeanor, how he would glance at his phone mid-conversation, smile faintly at whatever appeared, and then set it face down as though concealing a private sketch. The man who once recounted every deal and client now kept his calendar guarded, and while he had always been ambitious, this was a different kind of secrecy, one that seemed less about business and more about keeping her on the periphery. The apartment, once alive with their overlapping conversations, grew quieter, the pauses between words filling with things unsaid. She began to feel like a guest in her own life, moving carefully around a space that used to feel shared, unsure which walls could still bear weight. Her professional instincts told her that when a structure shows signs of strain, you inspect every joint, every beam, to locate the weakness. Yet in her marriage, she hesitated to push too hard, fearing that naming the fracture might hasten the collapse. Instead, she watched and listened, collecting small observations the way an architect collects site notes, knowing they would form a picture whether she wanted it to or not. She saw the way his tie was sometimes loosened, not from the strain of negotiation, but from a carelessness that suggested comfort elsewhere. And she caught faint traces of a perfume she didn't wear clinging to his jacket. Once passing his study, she heard his voice drop to a low register, warm in a way it hadn't been with her for months. When she knocked, there was the pause of someone tucking something away, followed by the door opening to reveal a flushed face and a hastily adjusted shirt. He said it was Penelope, discussing campaign details, and she nodded as if the explanation fit neatly, though in her mind it jutted out awkwardly like a column misplaced on the plan. Later, lying awake beside him, She found herself tracing the ceiling lines and wondering how long a building could stand once the first crack reached the foundation. By the time the campaign's billboards appeared across the city, Penelope's face was everywhere, her smile plastered above the streets like a promise of beauty and wealth. Thomas spoke about her in the same tone he used for high-value assets, describing her as a perfect fit for the brand, an investment already paying dividends. Liora listened, offering the polite encouragement expected of a supportive spouse, but inside she felt the ground shifting, as though someone had quietly redrawn the blueprints of her life without her consent. She wondered if anyone else noticed the undercurrent, how his eyes brightened when her name came up, how he spoke more about the campaign than about their shared projects, how his absences were now explained with the ease of a man reciting a well-rehearsed script. The city moved around them in its usual relentless rhythm, but within the walls of their apartment, something had slowed, calcified, and she could feel it pressing in. She told herself she was imagining it, that the mind could invent patterns where none existed, yet the instinct remained, sharp and insistent, like the warning groan of steel under too much load. And though she had not yet admitted it aloud, Liora knew she was already bracing for the sound of something giving way. It was a small rectangular slip of paper, folded once and tucked into the inside pocket of Thomas's tailored jacket. And Liora almost didn't notice it as she gathered his clothes for the dry cleaner. She wasn't looking for anything, wasn't trying to prove the suspicion that had been growing like hairline fractures through her days. But when the receipt slid out and landed on the floor, her eyes fell on the embossed gold lettering of the Grand Bellamy, a luxury hotel far above the range of business trip accommodations. She told herself not to read further, yet her fingers opened it before the thought had fully formed, tracing the date and the unmistakable notation. Penthouse suite. The amount charged was obscene for a single night, even for a man of Thomas's means. And in the space for guests, there was no name she recognized, just the sterile anonymity of a transaction that had tried to hide its intimacy behind professionalism. She stood in the quiet apartment, hearing the muted hum of the city through the glass, and felt a strange detachment, as though she were reviewing an architectural flaw in someone else's building, one she couldn't fix because she had no claim to the design. For a long moment, she simply stared at the receipt, waiting for her mind to explain, but every scenario she considered required her to ignore the knowledge her gut had been offering for weeks. When Thomas came home that evening, the receipt sat on the kitchen counter between them like an uninvited guest, its corners curling slightly under the weight of the overhead light. He paused when he saw it, and there was a flicker, too quick for most people to catch. In his expression, a tightening at the edges of his mouth that Liora recognized as recognition. She didn't speak right away, and the silence pressed in, demanding that he either explain or confess. Finally, she asked in a voice that was level but colder than she intended, "Who was with you at the Grand Bellamy?" Thomas's eyes met hers, but there was no flicker of apology, only a calculated stillness, as if he were choosing which story to tell. "I was meeting with investors from out of town," he said, but the lie was thin, barely stretched over the truth, and she didn't even need to challenge it before he exhaled in a way that suggested the effort of pretending wasn't worth it. "It was Penelope," he added, and though his tone was flat, the name landed between them like a weight that knocked the air out of the room. She didn't shout, didn't throw anything, didn't even cry. She simply asked, "Why?" and waited, knowing the answer would not heal her, but would mark the exact place where their marriage had split. He leaned against the counter, his hands resting on either side as though bracing himself against a tremor, and said, "Because she makes me feel alive again." It was the kind of line that might have sounded romantic in another story, but here it felt like a demolition notice, terse and impersonal. He went on, as if compelled to make the wound sharper. Penelope didn't question everything he did, didn't analyze every conversation, didn't make him feel as though he was being measured. She simply loved him, or at least that's what he believed love should feel like now. Liora listened, her mind cataloging every word the way she might catalog structural damages in a report, because later she would need to remember exactly how and why the collapse happened. There was no apology in his voice, no hesitation that suggested regret, and that, more than the affair itself, told her what she needed to know. He had already moved on in every way that mattered. "What about us?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady, and he looked at her with a kind of impatience that said the question itself was irrelevant, as though their shared history were nothing more than an outdated draft to be discarded. The conversation was short, not because there was nothing left to say, but because Thomas didn't see the point in prolonging it. He told her he wanted a divorce, that it was better for both of them, that they should make a clean break while things were still salvageable in terms of civility. Liora stood in the kitchen, her hands flat on the cool stone countertop, feeling the weight of every moment they had lived in this space, and realizing it was already no longer theirs. She didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't try to remind him of the years they had invested, because she could see in his face that the decision was final. The man she had built a life with was no longer standing across from her. He had been replaced by someone she didn't recognize. Someone who could dismiss their shared foundation as easily as sweeping dust from a windowsill. The air between them felt strange, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for one of them to move. She finally turned away, because there was nothing left in him to reach for. That night she lay awake in the dark, the city's glow painting soft lines across the ceiling, and thought about the way architects talk about controlled demolitions. You mark the weak points, set the charges, and let the structure fall in on itself, minimizing damage to the surrounding area. It struck her that Thomas had been doing exactly that, preparing the exit, marking the points where their life together would break cleanly, ensuring he could walk away with minimal debris. The discovery of the hotel receipt wasn't an accident. It was just the first charge going off, the warning that the rest was coming. She thought about confronting Penelope, about demanding an explanation from the woman whose name had become a constant in her husband's vocabulary. But the idea felt hollow. Penelope wasn't the architect of this destruction. Thomas was, and any confrontation would only serve as a distraction from that truth. Liora turned on her side, staring at the faint outline of the curtains, and wondered how long it would take for the dust to settle once the final collapse came. The next morning, the receipt was gone from the counter, but the space it had occupied remained as visible to her as if it had been carved into the stone. She moved through the apartment with the awareness that every object was now temporary, every surface already halfway to belonging to someone else. The framed photographs, the books they had chosen together, even the plants. They all seemed to be preparing for departure, as though they too sensed the shift. When Thomas left for the office, he kissed her cheek out of habit rather than affection, and she let him, because pretending for one more moment was easier than acknowledging the space his touch left behind. She didn't cry until he was gone, and even then the tears were brief, restrained, almost clinical, as though she were testing a faucet to see if it still worked. And when she finally wiped her face and looked around, she saw the apartment not as a home, but as a site awaiting demolition, its walls still standing, but its purpose already stripped away. The papers arrived without warning, hand-delivered by a man in a dark suit who stepped into the glass conference room of Liora's firm and asked in a voice that carried just enough authority to silence her mid-sentence, if she was Liora Okafor. She nodded, and he handed over the envelope with a polite, almost apologetic, "You've been served," before leaving her with the weight of a future she had not yet agreed to relinquish. Inside were the divorce filings, neatly typed demands for equitable distribution of assets, the division of property, and the dissolution of a marriage reduced to numbered clauses. The language was bloodless but brutal, each line stripping away a piece of the life she had built. She sat in her office for a long moment, reading and rereading, not because she didn't understand, but because she needed her mind to catch up to the fact that this was no longer speculation. Thomas hadn't asked for counseling, hadn't suggested mediation, hadn't even offered a conversation. He had gone directly to war, and the first shot had already been fired. Her attorney, a woman named Caroline Vega, was calm but firm as they sat in the polished wood conference room of her law office, reviewing the initial petition. Caroline's voice was steady, the kind that made you believe she'd seen worse and won, but her eyes sharpened when she reached the section accusing Liora of neglecting her marriage due to an overinvestment in her career. It was a calculated move, an attempt to cast Liora as a woman so consumed by her ambitions that she had driven her husband into someone else's arms. The claim was baseless, but in court, perception could become truth if repeated often enough. Thomas's legal team framed his financial contributions as the engine of their lifestyle, implying that her architectural firm had flourished solely because of the connections he had provided. The subtext was clear. They intended to make her success look borrowed, as though she were a tenant in a house built entirely by him. Liora, however, had not built her career on borrowed foundations, and she had the records to prove it. Years of invoices, correspondence, project proposals, and investment agreements were stored in both digital and physical files, organized with the precision of someone who knew that memory alone was not enough to safeguard the truth. Caroline's eyes lit with a quiet satisfaction as Liora began producing evidence, not just of her earnings, but of her direct contributions to Thomas's business ventures. She had assisted in drafting proposals for major developments, hosted potential investors in their home, and provided design input that had elevated the market value of several properties. Every late night she'd spent reviewing presentation decks with him. Every weekend she'd surrendered to site visits at his insistence. She could quantify them all. This was not sentiment, it was fact. And in the sterile world of legal proceedings, fact had the power to cut through even the most elaborate narratives. The first court appearance was less about arguing the merits of their respective positions and more about setting the tone. Thomas arrived in a tailored charcoal suit, his tie knotted to perfection, radiating the calm confidence of a man used to negotiating from a position of strength. Penelope was not present, though Liora caught a faint trace of her perfume on the lapel of his coat when he leaned slightly toward his attorney. His legal team was polished and aggressive, their opening statements delivered with the practiced cadence of professionals who believed they had already won. They painted Liora as cold, analytical, a woman who saw relationships in terms of blueprints and timelines, incapable of the spontaneous warmth a man like Thomas supposedly needed. Liora sat still, her hands folded in her lap, absorbing every word without flinching. She understood that outrage would serve their narrative, and she refused to give them that satisfaction. When it was Caroline's turn, the tone shifted. She spoke not with volume, but with precision, dismantling their claims point by point. She presented evidence of Liora's financial independence before and during the marriage, highlighted her role in securing clients who had later invested in Thomas's developments, and produced signed statements from colleagues and investors attesting to her professionalism and collaborative nature. The room was silent except for Caroline's voice, and for the first time since the proceedings began, Thomas's expression flickered. It wasn't guilt. It was the faint, irritated recognition that she had come prepared, that she would not be an easy opponent to dismantle. The weeks that followed were a grind of depositions, document requests, and tense negotiations. Thomas's team tried to bury Liora in paperwork, hoping the volume would exhaust her, but she met each demand with meticulous responses. She spent late nights at her office, poring over contracts and correspondence. The same discipline she once used to perfect design plans, now directed toward protecting her future. Friends and colleagues began to see the toll, the faint shadows under her eyes, the way her smile held for a fraction of a second too short. But she refused to show weakness in any room that mattered. Each meeting with Caroline ended the same way, with a handshake and a quiet acknowledgement that they were gaining ground. The settlement, when it finally came, was a compromise in legal terms, but a victory in spirit. Liora kept her architectural firm without restriction, retained her share of their jointly acquired assets, and received a modest alimony that acknowledged, however grudgingly, her contributions to the life they had shared. Thomas, predictably, wanted the matter concluded quickly, his attention already fixed on the image he would project once the ink was dry. There was no handshake, no parting words, just the final exchange of signatures and the dull thud of a stamped court order on the table. In that moment, Liora felt a strange stillness, as if the noise of the preceding months had collapsed into silence. Walking out of the courthouse, she did not feel triumphant, but she did feel intact, and that was its kind of victory. She had weathered the attempt to erase her, to reduce her to a footnote in someone else's narrative, and had emerged still holding the pen. Yet the emotional debris was heavier than she'd anticipated. The legal win did not soothe the personal loss. The marriage was over, the partnership dissolved, and though the papers declared an equitable resolution, She knew that no claws could restore what had been broken. As she stepped into the street, the city's air cool against her skin, she realized that survival had a sound. It was the quiet inhale you take after standing your ground while the storm passes, and the knowledge that you are still standing when it does. The first weeks after the settlement felt like moving through the husk of a building after its tenants had gone. The echo of footsteps in empty rooms reminding Liora of what used to be there. Her new apartment was smaller, perched above a quieter street where the hum of traffic was muted by the wind in the plane trees. And though the space was hers alone, it carried the sterile emptiness of something still waiting to be lived in. She left most of the boxes unopened, keeping only her drafting table, a set of sketchbooks, and the battered coffee press that had followed her from one address to another since her student days. Some mornings she would sit cross-legged on the hardwood floor, coffee cooling in her hands, and stare at the bare walls as if she could will them to absorb her history and hold it for her until she was ready to take it back. The absence of Thomas was both a relief and a raw wound. She could breathe without bracing for the sound of his key in the door. Yet she found herself turning to tell him things before remembering there was no one to hear them. Amara arrived one Saturday without warning, her arms full of groceries and the kind of authority that didn't wait for permission. She set coffee on the counter and told Liora, in the blunt way only a sister can, to stop letting a man who had walked away keep editing her story. Liora tried to protest, but Amara pressed on, reminding her of the woman she had been before the marriage, the one who stayed up all night drafting competition entries for the thrill of seeing her vision take shape. That version of herself hadn't vanished, Amara insisted. She'd just been buried under someone else's blueprint. Nia came later that week with wine and sharper words, pointing out that Thomas had always been looking for a reason she wasn't enough, and that it was a game she could never have won. Liora listened because they were right, yet it felt like being told she could walk when her legs still remembered the limp. She began rebuilding the only way she knew how, through work. Without the endless social obligations and the constant undercurrent of Thomas's networking, her days stretched open in ways she hadn't realized she needed. She took on projects she'd been forced to decline before, including a community center in an underserved neighborhood that had been dismissed by Thomas as not profitable enough to bother with. The project was modest in budget but rich in possibilities, and she poured herself into it, meeting with residents to understand their needs, designing spaces that could shift between after-school programs, art workshops, and neighborhood meetings. Each sketch felt like laying a brick in her foundation, one that belonged entirely to her. As the months passed, the work multiplied. The community center's design drew attention from a small but influential circle of clients who valued her ability to combine beauty with purpose, and soon she was fielding offers for projects she'd once only dreamed of. She began arriving at her office before sunrise, the city still yawning awake below her window, and leaving long after the streets had swallowed the last light. Yet this was a different kind of exhaustion from the kind she had known in her marriage. This was the weariness that came from building something that mattered. She started to feel her confidence returning in increments. First in the way she spoke about her work without softening her language, then in the way she held her head when walking into a meeting. Outside of work, she made deliberate choices to reclaim parts of herself she'd left unattended. She joined a yoga studio not because it was fashionable, but because the quiet discipline of the practice anchored her restless thoughts. She began hiking on weekends, sometimes with Amara or Nia, sometimes alone, following winding trails until her body ached and her mind felt scrubbed clean. Cooking became another small reclamation. She found pleasure in preparing meals that didn't need to impress anyone, letting herself experiment without an audience. The apartment, once bare, began to fill with signs of her presence, plants that thrived in the morning light, stacks of architecture books by the window, a gallery of sketches pinned above her drafting table like a living map of her next chapter. Occasionally, she would hear updates about Thomas and Penelope through mutual acquaintances. They had moved into a penthouse with sweeping city views. She had left modeling to focus on supporting his career, which seemed to translate into hosting lavish parties and curating their life for social media. The photographs that sometimes found their way to Liora's phone showed them draped in designer clothes, smiling in the glow of chandeliers, each image polished to perfection. She would feel the sting, a sharp reminder of what had been taken, but the ache no longer lasted as long. More and more, she found herself turning her attention back to the life she was building, one that didn't require performance or pretense. The turning point came when she was approached by a luxury eco-resort developer who had seen her community-focused designs and wanted that same sensibility applied to a high-profile project. It was the kind of commission that could redefine a career, and the client made it clear they had sought her out specifically. The meetings were intense, the expectations high, but Liora thrived under the weight of them. She led her team with clarity, made bold design choices, and negotiated terms without hesitation. When the contract was signed, she allowed herself a rare moment of celebration. Standing alone in her office, looking out at the city skyline, she felt a surge of pride not just in the win, but in the fact that she had arrived here on her terms. She began therapy shortly after, not because she was broken, but because she wanted to understand how she had once lost herself so completely in someone else's vision. The sessions were uncomfortable at first, peeling back layers she had kept sealed, but they gave her tools, boundaries that felt like solid walls rather than fragile partitions, a clearer sense of where her worth began and ended. She learned the difference between loving someone and erasing herself to keep them close, and she promised herself she would never cross that line again. One evening, months into this new rhythm, she stood in her apartment surrounded by the hum of her own life, the soft rustle of leaves from the balcony plants, the faint scratch of her pencil against paper, the steady boil of water on the stove, and realized she no longer measured her days by what she had lost. She was, in every way that mattered, rebuilding, and each choice she made was another brick laid, another wall raised, another roof beam set in place. The structure wasn't finished, but it was hers, and that was more than enough. It was Amara who delivered the news, her voice carrying that mix of caution and curiosity reserved for telling someone about an old wound being touched again. She called Liora on a quiet evening, the city outside softened by rain, and said she'd heard from a friend that Thomas and Penelope were engaged. The wedding, according to the whispers already circulating in their old social circle, would be a grand affair at the Cathedral of St. Michael, with an invitation list packed with the city's most influential names. Liora listened in silence, her hand tracing the rim of her coffee mug, not because she didn't care, but because she was waiting for the emotion to rise, the way it once would have without warning. Instead, there was only a muted thrum, a curiosity that surprised her. Amara hesitated before asking if she was all right, and Liora found herself answering honestly. She was. There was no sharpness in her chest, no heat in her throat, just a strange, quiet urge to see it with her own eyes, to watch the man who had once sworn forever to her speak those same words to someone else. When she told Amara she wanted to go, her sister's reaction was immediate disbelief, the kind that comes out as a question asked too loudly. Amara reminded her that weddings weren't arenas for closure, that showing up could look like an act of pettiness, even if that wasn't her intention. But Liora shook her head and explained that she wasn't going for revenge, wasn't looking to interrupt, wasn't interested in playing the part of the scorned woman. She wanted to see it for herself, to close the door on that chapter with the sound of vows that no longer had any claim over her. Amara didn't like it, but after a pause long enough to stretch between them, she accepted it. She even offered to come along, but Liora declined. This was something she needed to face alone, without the cushion of someone else's presence. The days that followed carried a hum of preparation, though not the kind she had once done for galas or business dinners. This was quieter, more deliberate. She chose a dress in deep navy, a color that felt strong without shouting, elegant without competing. She booked an appointment to have her hair styled in soft, deliberate waves, not to mimic Penelope's image, but to reflect her own. When she looked in the mirror that morning, she saw a woman who had weathered storms without losing her structure, someone whose beauty came from the steadiness she carried, rather than the sparkle she displayed. It wasn't about making an entrance. It was about showing up in a way that told her own story, even if no one there knew it. On the morning of the wedding, the air felt crisp, the kind of cool that sharpened edges and made colors stand out. Liora took her time dressing, fastening her bracelet with steady hands, slipping into her heels without rushing. As she locked her apartment door, she thought about how different this felt from the life she had once lived with Thomas. No frantic schedules, no performative smiles, no sense that her worth was tied to how well she matched the image beside him. She drove through the city with the windows cracked, letting the air carry away whatever nervousness might have lingered, and arrived at the cathedral early enough to blend into the flow of guests. The Cathedral of St. Michael was even more opulent than she remembered from photographs, a towering facade of stone and glass, its doors framed by white roses and the low, steady hum of a string quartet. She walked up the steps slowly, feeling the weight of the place but refusing to let it press on her. Inside, the vaulted ceiling drew the eye upward, the air perfumed with flowers and polished wood. Guests were dressed in their finest, their conversations weaving together into a polite murmur that hushed whenever someone important passed by. Liora found a seat near the back, in a pew where she could see everything without being the center of anyone's attention. From her vantage point, she recognized faces she hadn't seen since the divorce. Former colleagues of Thomas, investors whose hands she had once shaken, women who had leaned in to tell her she was lucky to have a man like him. Some of them noticed her and did double takes, surprise flickering across their features before they smoothed them into polite neutrality. She returned their glances with a small, controlled smile, the kind that neither invited conversation nor shut it down. The music shifted, signaling the ceremony's start, and the chatter faded into stillness. When Thomas appeared at the altar, Liora felt a faint ripple of recognition, as though seeing an old photograph brought to life. He looked every bit the part, impeccable in his tuxedo, carrying the calm confidence he wore like a tailored coat. But there was something else now, something more deliberate in the way he scanned the crowd, as if aware of the image he was projecting in every direction. Then came Penelope, radiant in a gown that shimmered with a calculated elegance, her smile wide enough to reach the farthest pews. Liora studied her, not with malice, but with the quiet observation of someone who had once been in that place, feeling the same swell of attention and the same certainty that nothing could touch her. The ceremony unfolded with the smoothness of something rehearsed down to the breath. The readings were chosen for their poetry, and the vows spoken with perfect intonation. And yet, to Leora's ear, the words carried a hollow echo, too polished to hold the grit of real endurance. She sat still, her gaze steady, letting each promise drift past her without anchoring. When the minister's voice lifted to ask the question that tradition required, whether anyone present knew a reason these two should not be joined, there was a pause so deep it seemed the cathedral itself was holding its breath. Leora's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the pew, but she did not yet move. The question hung in the air like a key suspended above a lock, and though she had come without the intent to turn it, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing in. In that stillness, she understood why she had come. Not to interrupt, not to reclaim, but to witness the closing of a blueprint she had once believed in, to see it folded and filed away, where it could no longer dictate the shape of her life. Whatever happened next, she knew, would be hers to decide. And for the first time in a long while, the choice felt entirely in her hands. Objection. I do. The words left Leora's mouth with the precision of a line drawn in ink, cutting through the cathedral's hush just as the minister's question began to fade. Heads turned in unison, a ripple of surprise moving through the guests as they registered who had spoken. She rose from her seat near the back, her movements deliberate. Each step down the aisle measured as if she were walking the length of a blueprint she had committed to memory. The click of her heels against the marble floor punctuated the silence, the sound crisp against the layered hush of the organ's soft sustain. She could feel eyes tracking her, their surprise mingling with recognition, and beneath that, speculation. Why was she here, and what could she possibly have to say? Liora kept her gaze forward, her chin lifted, the navy dress she had chosen moving in quiet waves around her as though it belonged in the space. At the altar, Thomas's expression shifted from confident composure to something taut and brittle, the easy charm stripped away by the sight of her. Penelope's smile faltered, confusion pulling at its edges, her grip on Thomas's arm tightening just enough to betray her sudden unease. Liora did not greet them, nor did she address the congregation. She turned to the minister with a small, polite nod and said she had something the groom needed to see before he made a legal commitment that could not be undone. From her clutch, she withdrew a manila folder, its edges worn from handling, and held it out to Thomas. For a moment he didn't move, his hand hovering as if accepting it might make the moment irrevocable. When he finally took it, his fingers brushed hers briefly, and she felt none of the warmth that had once passed so easily between them. The folder opened with the faint rustle of paper, and Thomas's eyes scanned the first page. Liora watched the color shift in his face, the practiced stillness giving way to a flicker of disbelief. Inside were certified copies of marriage records and divorce filings that had never been finalized, documents proving that Penelope Hart was, in fact, Bethany Carlson, and that she was still legally married to a man named Paul Hendris. There was also evidence of previous attempts to access her spouse's finances through a combination of charm, manipulation, and calculated lies. Liora had included photographs, witness statements, and correspondence, enough to remove any trace of doubt. She spoke, her voice carrying without the need to raise it, explaining that she had discovered the truth not out of spite, but during a background check related to a failed property deal, one that had initially seemed unrelated to Penelope, but had led inevitably to her. Penelope tried to respond, her voice pitching higher as she said it was impossible, a misunderstanding, perhaps even a smear, but the denial lacked weight, and the room had already shifted against her. Guests leaned toward each other in muted whispers, their curiosity sharpening into judgment. The minister cleared his throat, looking as though he would rather be anywhere else, while Thomas's lawyer, seated among the guests, rose halfway from his seat before thinking better of intervening. Liora did not waver. She simply stated that whatever Thomas chose to do with the information was his decision, but he deserved to know before saying vows that could entangle him in legal complications far beyond his imagination. Thomas's voice when it came was tight, stripped of its usual smoothness. He asked why she would bring this here, now, in front of everyone. She met his gaze without flinching and told him that, despite everything between them, she had never wished him harm, and she believed the truth had a way of surfacing whether or not you were ready for it. Better here, she said, than months from now, when the damage could no longer be undone without tearing apart more lives. The weight of her words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unshakable. Penelope began to speak again, but her voice was drowned by the rising murmur of the crowd, the carefully curated elegance of the ceremony unraveling thread by thread. The tension in the room built like pressure against the glass. Thomas glanced from Liora to the folder and then to Penelope, as if searching for a version of reality that would make sense. But the documents in his hands were undeniable, the ink and stamps bearing the authority of official record. He asked Penelope directly if it was true, and when she hesitated, just for a breath, just long enough, her silence answered for her. Liora didn't wait for the collapse that followed. She stepped back, turned, and began the same measured walk down the aisle, the sound of her heels again marking each pace. Behind her, the voices swelled, accusations, denials, and the low gasp of guests processing the scene they had just witnessed. She didn't look back. Outside, the spring air met her like a clean break, the cathedral's heavy scent of roses and polished wood giving way to something lighter. The sky was pale and open, and the city's noise, muted inside the stone walls, returned in full, a reminder that life was still moving forward, indifferent to what had just fractured inside. At the bottom of the cathedral steps, she paused, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time since Amar had told her about the wedding, the weight she had carried in her chest loosened. It was not triumph she felt, nor vindication. It was the clarity of a chapter closed, not in ink or court documents, but in the quiet certainty that nothing in that building could claim her anymore. She had come to witness the final folding of a story that had once been hers, and in doing so, she had ensured it would not be rewritten without the truth. As she walked toward the street, blending into the city's rhythm, she thought about how some structures collapse loudly in a single moment, while others are dismantled piece by piece. This one, she realized, had done both, and she was no longer inside it when the walls came down. 4 months passed before Liora heard Thomas's name again, and even then, it came in the form of a casual remark from a colleague who had seen him at a development conference, alone. The memory of the cathedral had faded into something distant, like a building glimpsed through fog, more silhouette than detail. But the world has a way of circling back, and soon flowers were arriving at her office. Expensive arrangements of white lilies and roses, accompanied by unsigned cards in a handwriting she knew too well. Then came the letters, delivered in thick envelopes, written in careful, deliberate prose about regret, mistakes, and the hope for a conversation. Liora read them once each, then set them aside without answering. The man writing them was no longer the man she had once loved. He was someone else entirely, and she had no desire to reacquaint herself with him. One afternoon, she returned from a site visit to find Thomas himself in the lobby of her firm, dressed in the same tailored confidence he had always worn, but without the unshakable polish. His smile was tentative, the kind that sought permission before it could settle, and he asked if she had time to talk. Liora declined with the same quiet steadiness she had shown at the altar, telling him there was nothing more to discuss. For a moment, he seemed about to argue, but then he simply nodded and stepped back, as though realizing that no amount of charm could bridge the distance between them. She left him standing there, turning her focus to the projects waiting on her desk, the ones that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the life she was building. Her work was thriving. The eco-resort contract had evolved into a portfolio of sustainable designs for high-profile clients who valued her ability to combine innovation with purpose. Each site visit was a reminder that her influence now stretched far beyond the city skyline. She was shaping spaces that would outlast temporary alliances and fragile promises. She traveled to coastal towns and mountain ridges, studying the way light fell on new terrain, and returned home with sketches that carried the texture of these places. Her team grew, not just in size but in shared vision, and for the first time, she felt the rare satisfaction of leading without compromise. Outside of work, her life had shifted into a rhythm that felt entirely her own. She spent evenings at the small jazz bar around the corner from her apartment, where the music wrapped around her like a soft curtain and conversations flowed without pretense. Weekend hikes became longer, her routes winding through unfamiliar trails that forced her to trust her sense of direction. In the quiet of her apartment, she cooked for herself and sometimes for company, plating dishes with the same care she gave to her architectural models. The space had filled with her presence, the plants now climbing toward the ceiling, the wall of framed sketches mapping her journey from tentative new beginnings to unapologetic stability. It was during one of these hikes that she met David Rowe, another architect whose portfolio was as impressive as his appreciation for the process behind each design. They spoke first about trail markers and weather, then about the challenge of integrating historical preservation into modern projects. Conversations extended into shared coffees, then dinners, and eventually into a companionship that felt unlike anything she had known with Thomas. David valued her ideas without seeing them as competition. He admired her drive without interpreting it as a threat. With him, there was no need to negotiate for space in the blueprint. They simply built side by side, each addition strengthening rather than weakening the structure. Occasionally, the thought of Thomas and Penelope, Bethany as the documents had shown, would surface, but it no longer carried the sting it once had. The last she heard, they had separated quietly, avoiding the spectacle that had consumed their wedding day. Liora felt no satisfaction in their unraveling, no sense of victory. Instead, there was only the recognition that some structures are never meant to bear weight, no matter how beautiful their facades. She had learned that lesson in full, and she carried it forward not as bitterness, but as knowledge. Her therapist once asked her what closure looked like, and she had struggled to answer at the time. Now she realized it wasn't a moment or a gesture or even a conversation. It was the day she stopped measuring her worth against the absence of someone else's validation. Closure was designing a building that would stand for generations without needing to be propped up by borrowed beams. It was standing at a construction site, wind tugging at her hair, and knowing the work in front of her was enough. It was looking at David across a table and feeling seen, not compared. The city moved on around her, as cities always do, but Liora no longer felt like she was racing to keep up. She walked its streets with a sense of ownership, not because she possessed any part of it, but because she had found her place within it. Each project she completed added to the quiet architecture of her own life, one built on self-respect, resilience, and the refusal to let someone else's inability to love her define her value. The marriage had ended, the chapter had closed, and yet here she was, standing in the light of what she had built alone, knowing it was stronger for having been constructed from the ground up. And in the rare moments when she thought of that day in the cathedral, she no longer pictured the gasps or the whispers. She remembered instead the sound of her voice, clear and unwavering, as she chose truth over silence. It was the sound of steel being set into place, a support beam in the framework of the person she had become. She carried it with her now, not as a weapon, but as part of the foundation she would never again let anyone dismantle. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. And I would love to know what you think about Liora's journey. What moments spoke to you? What choices you agreed or disagreed with? And how you might have acted in her place? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can continue the conversation. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch more stories of resilience, truth, and transformation. I truly appreciate your time and hope to see you in the next story.